Good Sunday morning. I'm Jaden Jefferson, and welcome to this week's Community Focus. Ohio was a closely watched state on Election Day, not for the presidential race, but for the U.S. Senate race, which ended in a victory for Republican Bernie Moreno over incumbent Senator Sherrod Brown. And I'm discussing that today with Dr. Melissa Miller, professor of political science at Bowling Green State University. First things first, the U.S. Senate race, Senator Sherrod Brown being unseated by Bernie Moreno. Kind of talk about this race and how that may have happened.
Well, Ohio may not have been a battleground state in the presidential election yesterday, but it was absolutely central to Republicans' ability to retake the Senate majority, which they did, in part because Sherrod Brown, the Democratic incumbent from Ohio since 2006, lost his race to Republican Bernie Moreno. I think one of the big factors in the race that helped Bernie Moreno was, of course, that Trump endorsement that he had from the primary and really campaigned on that throughout the fall, all the way up till Election Day. If we just go back 2 years when J.D. Vance beat Tim Ryan, the Democrat, J.D. Vance as well had that really valuable Trump endorsement, which I think in both cases was really helpful. The Trump name is huge here in Ohio. Not to get ahead of ourselves, but Donald Trump now has won the state of Ohio and its electoral college votes 3 times in a row. And so Republicans who are able to associate themselves with Trump, have them in appearances with him, get advertising out of those appearances, and really market that endorsement, that's a tremendous help. To the extent that Donald Trump was leading in Ohio throughout, based on all the polling, and had won the state twice in the past, Sherrod Brown really was facing some pretty strong headwinds. He ran the kind of campaign that he used to be able to win in Ohio. A lot of focus on the dignity of work, a lot of focus on that willingness to cross the aisle, to vote against his own party, the Democrats, for instance, on the North American Free Trade Agreement, on the Central American Free Trade Agreement, issues like that. It wasn't enough this time, however, for Sherrod Brown, and Bernie Moreno ended up winning somewhat handily. It didn't help that Kamala Harris didn't do well in Ohio, so there were no presidential coattails for Sherrod Brown, although it should be noted that he's won before, although he was first elected in 2006, then reelected in 2012. Who was the Democrat at the top of the ticket that year? Barack Obama. So that's the only previous time that Sherrod Brown was running when there was a race on the ballot for president. And that time, the headwinds were really in his favor. I think I'm maybe not getting my sailing term quite right, not being a boating woman, but I think viewers and listeners will get the idea. This was a tough one for Sherrod Brown, and it didn't pan out in the end.
And one other thing I'm sure didn't help as well was the amount of spending in this Senate race. It was the most expensive in the country, and a lot of that money was put against Sherrod Brown, on top of the fact that the state has also gone more right. It used to be a purple state. It used to predict the winner of presidential elections up until 2020, and that trend has changed, and Ohio is now considered a red state. And so what role did that play in Sherrod Brown ending his run in the Senate?
Yes, in addition to his prior years in the U.S. Congress. So it's really it's really an end to what has been many years in which he has served as a Democrat in both chambers of Congress. Now, to the amount of money that was spent, and particularly to the amount of money and the wide circulation of negative advertisements against Sherrod Brown. What we know from the political science research is that money doesn't always win campaigns, and the amount of money that you have available for advertising does not always win. However, we do know that sometimes negative advertising can really resonate with voters. It's what they remember. So while Ohioans and Americans in general complain, I don't like the ads, I don't care about the ads, I change the channel when the ads come on, or I just throw those flyers, that direct mail away. We also know from the research, despite voters telling us that, negative advertising can work. And particularly with the Trump endorsement and the amount of money that did go in on the Marino side, he was really able to boost his name recognition, number one. He was able to link Sherrod Brown with the top of the ticket. And Sherrod Brown, like I said, had emphasized, frankly, his independence, his relative independence over the years from his own party on some key issues that pertain to the Ohio economy, its manufacturing base, and so forth. It wasn't enough. It wasn't enough for Sherrod Brown. And so Bernie Moreno becomes the first Hispanic American to be elected statewide to any office here statewide in Ohio. So history was made in the election of Bernie Moreno here in Ohio, and that should be noted.
For sure. And one other thing with this election in this US Senate race was obviously the fact that we found out in terms of the presidential race that there were a lot of states where the vice president was underperforming. And of course, that could have been one of those contributing factors that you mentioned. And so looking at Ohio in this sense, I mean, are we really a model for the country anymore? Or is Ohio kind of on its own and just being its own red state at this point?
I really think Ohio's a red state. So Sherrod Brown was always pointed to as the example of, oh, Democrats can still win statewide. All right. So Donald Trump carried the state in 2016. He carried it again in 2020. But again, we could point to Sherrod Brown's victory in 2018 as a statewide Democrat. There were also a couple of Democrats, there were several Democrats on the Ohio Supreme Court. And in two of those three races, the Democrat lost. So now there is one Democrat elected to statewide office, and that's in a judicial post on the Ohio Supreme Court. So as with some others, I'm one who looks at it over the long term, right? One election doesn't change a state from, purple to blue or purple to red, or certainly not from, red to blue. However, I do want to look at data over, multiple election cycles, and I think we are just so squarely in the red column, with Democrats really receding here as a force in Ohio politics. As I said, only one Democrat elected statewide, and that's on the Ohio Supreme Court. One of the implications that that has for politics here in Ohio is that you don't end up having sort of your JV team, right? Like if you're always in the minority and you're never winning, this is true whether it's Democrats in the minority here in Ohio in terms of, both houses of the state legislature, both chambers on the Ohio Supreme Court, in statewide office, et cetera, in congressional offices. Then if you're always in the background, how do you find a Democrat who can catch fire and run for governor, or catch fire and run next time around for US Senate? You don't really have that farm team when Democrats are out of power for so long. And so there will, I'm sure, be some real soul searching among Democrats in the state of Ohio, as in a number of other states and nationally, at yesterday's results, which were a big sweep for Republicans.
And one of the things that the senator did in this campaign was he was trying to get the appeal of both sides here. Obviously, he knows he's going to have that Democratic support, but he was trying to talk about issues that you hear Republicans talk about, like the economy, manufacturing, jobs, immigration. And we're seeing more and more Democrats do this. Do you think that this will actually solve their problem? Because it seems that these are top issues for Americans, but when it comes to the polls, Democrats aren't able to really get those issues and get those voters in who are concerned about those things.
I think one of the challenges for Democrats running for governor, running for US Senate, for congressional seats, and for state houses is that there's been a real nationalization of politics. So even if you're in that minority party, whether it's Democrats here in Ohio or you're a Republican running in California, you can really try to target that message, make it about local issues, make it about sort of your personal brand or your personal record. But most Americans are getting the national news updates, and they're getting that on their phones. They're getting that on cable news at night. And so I think it's become harder and harder to run a campaign from the minority party within a given state and really disconnect yourself from what's happening at the national level. Sherrod Brown had done that successfully in the past, and it didn't work this time around.
And that's this week's Community Focus. And thanks to Dr. Miller for joining me. Have a great rest of your week.